Hello and welcome. My name is Danny Bottino. I am a doctoral candidate in history at Rutgers University. I am from Kittery Point, just down the road, and I study social and cultural history of Europe and early modern North America, focusing specifically on 17th century Maine. I'm very happy to be here in York's old burial ground, one of the oldest extant burial grounds in the state of Maine. It was first used in the 17th century and has a very good number of early 18th century stones in very good shape. Now, one of the most famous stones, I would say the most famous stone in this burial ground, is in back of me here. This is a 1774 gravestone, and it's a gravestone of a woman who lived and died in York named Mary Nasson, Nasson, and she died at the age of 29 and was buried here in the less populated, seemingly, half of the graveyard. If you look at the surviving headstones, there's not too many of them in this area. Now, that doesn't mean that this area was not used for burials. What it means is that most of the people buried here did not use permanent stones. They were either marked with wooden markers, or perhaps with no markers, or maybe with what we call field stones, which were simply any stone you could find in a field, usually with nothing written on them, and these are easily lost as the centuries pass. Nevertheless, where we are standing is filled with very probably 18th century and 17th century burials. Now, Mary Nasson's stone differs, of course, from the typical burial in this part of the graveyard in that not only does she have a stone, she has one of the most finely carved and probably one of the most valuable stones in the graveyard. I would say that when this was purchased by her husband after she died in 1774, it would have cost him a good sum. Now, let's take a look at what's on this gravestone. A typical 18th century gravestone has two parts. It has a headstone and a smaller footstone. The footstone marks where the feet of the person buried are, and the headstone marks where their head is. Now, Mary Nasson's stone is different from every other stone and is different from the typical 18th century gravestone in that it has three parts. So in addition to the headstone and the footstone, it has this large slab in the middle, a stone slab, which joins the headstone to the footstone. Now, as you can see, we don't really see much of a footstone here. Now, when I was a little kid, I remember vividly coming to the burial ground here and seeing Mary Nasson's footstone, which was larger than a typical footstone. It had a very nice angel carved into it. Now, an angel is a more typical symbol that you'll see on an 18th century stone. There's quite a few angels on the other stones here in the graveyard, and Mary Nasson's footstone had a rather typical angel. Now, this footstone, I remember very well the day that it was broken. I was a junior docent at the time. I remember coming in and saying, "Where did the footstone go?" And I was told that someone mowing the graveyard had hit the footstone with their lawnmower, and so it broke at the base. Now, the footstone, I am told, is safe. It's still in good shape. It just has not been put back where it used to be. So hopefully someday that will happen. And in fact, there are images of what this footstone looked like prior to it being broken. Now, the big question is, why is there this big slab here? And that it probably is at the heart of why this gravestone is so famous. So, this slab here covers where Mary Nasson's coffin would have been buried. Now, Why was this slab put here? Almost certainly, given how close it is to the headstone and the footstone, it was put here at the same time that the headstone and the footstone were put up. Now, there's no primary source record, there's no letter or diary that we have that tells us why this slab was put here. Almost certainly, what I think is most probable is that this was put here to keep animals from digging up the newly buried body. Now, you may think that's somewhat strange, or right in the middle of the town, there's not too many animals, but yet even in the 21st century at night, there's still a lot of animals running through here. And if we go back to 1774, York is a very different town, and you have a lot of farmers. Almost everyone, even if they're not a farmer, owns animals. Everyone has pigs, cows, chickens, and of course horses, and they're running around everywhere. And dogs. That's probably the biggest one. Everyone is letting their dogs almost certainly run freely through the town. And then of course you have wild animals too. All of these animals could have posed a danger to a freshly buried corpse in the burial ground. In fact, we have records of the man who owned the house in back of me, the Emerson house, a man named Bulkley Emerson, who when he was living there in the early 1800s, so not too long after Mary Nasson was buried, we know that although his primary occupation was as a merchant, we know that he and his family owned pigs. And being right next to the burial ground, these pigs roamed freely through the burial ground. We have written records of controversy, I believe, of the church saying that, Bulkley, you have to make sure your pigs don't cause damage in the burial ground. Pigs certainly like to dig up things. So I think that Mary Nasson's widow, Samuel Nasson, knowing all of this, chose to put the stone here. Now you may ask, why did no one else choose to put stones over the graves of their loved ones? And there's a few possible ways we can answer that. The first is that they may have, and that those stones are now all lost. Now there's an image we have. The earliest image of the burial ground was drawn by a York man who, when he was old, in the late 1800s, was told to draw what the burial ground in the church looked like when he was young in the 1830s. And the image that he drew shows almost all of the stones having what looks like a similar slab to Mary Nasson's stone. Now it may be that his memory was off and he knew that Mary Nasson's stone had a slab and he simply thought that every other stone had a slab when he was young. Or it may be that he was correct and that all these other slabs have vanished. The other possible reason is that most of the people buried here would have had family members in the area to come by and check on the site of their loved ones' burials on a daily basis. Of course, with the Emersons, they could look out their kitchen window and see where their family was buried. And most other families buried here lived pretty close by. For Mary Nasson, we know that soon after her death, her husband Samuel moved to Sanford, Maine, which in the 18th century is pretty far. Even nowadays, it's a 40-minute drive. In the 18th century, it would have maybe taken a whole day to ride from Sanford down to York. So he was not here to look after the grave of his young wife. So very probably, he said, I'm going to make sure that no animal or even human maybe bothers her grave, and so I'll just leave this slab here. Now, this story of the slab and of the grave as a whole has a very long afterlife. And that, of course, is the legends and the myths that have grown up surrounding what people in the 21st century call the witch's grave. As I mentioned, the footstone of Mary Nasson had a fairly typical angel symbol on it. The headstone is quite different. Now, For 18th century New England gravestone art, you have two dominant images, which you'll see in every graveyard from Maine down to southern New England and even further down the eastern seaboard. You'll see the angel, which is the head of an angel with wings, often smiling, sometimes called a cherub. And then you'll see a grimmer, but somewhat similar symbol, which is the death's head, and which looks like a skull with wings. Now, I have already discussed in detail these two images in a previous segment that I filmed here in the burial ground. But this background is critical to understanding the myths and the legends that have grown up and that still surround Mary Nason's stone. For as you'll see when you look at her headstone, she does not have an angel or a death's head, or indeed the newer image which was starting to come into fashion in the late 18th century, which is the urn and the willow. She does not have either of these three images. Rather, she has what we call a portrait stone. So, simply, she has an image of a woman on her stone, which is presumably a portrait of Mary Nason. Now, it's not a realistic portrait. It is very probably a stylized portrait. She may have looked similar to this woman. She may have looked completely different. What the purpose of the image is not to be realistic. The purpose of the image is to create a representation of her as a human being. And this is something that's quite different from previous 18th century gravestone art, in that the death's head and the angel and even the urn and willow are all images of mourning, and they're images of death, and there's a lot of religious symbolism going on there. They're less focused on the individual who has died than on the general concept of death, the afterlife, and mourning. This is very much focused on the individual person, Mary Nason, who has died. As I said, this is the only portrait stone of its type here in the York burial ground, and indeed that I know of in York. However, this is a distinct genre of 18th century gravestone art. It's not as if this is the only portrait stone that we know of anywhere in New England. And in fact, there were gravestone carvers who, while carving death's heads and angels, were also, if they were asked to by their clients, would carve these portrait stones. And most of them are in the similar style to Mary Nason's portrait here. In fact, if you go down to Portsmouth, specifically to the Old North burial ground in Portsmouth, you'll see at least one stone also of a woman who died in the late 18th century who has a very similar portrait to Mary Nason's stone. It almost certainly was carved by the same carver or by the same carving business. Now, there are some portrait stones, and there is one that I can think of a member of the Wheelwright family in Wells, which is, well, still a portrait stone. It's not a stylized image. It is a very, very detailed image of what this man would have looked like in real life. And so if you go up to the old burial ground in Wells, you'll see a 1740s stone, and you'll see, I believe it's John Wheelwright, and you'll see his image, and this looks almost like a photograph of what he would have looked like. So that is a style of portrait stone. That's not what the carver of this stone was going for. And you'll see this is certainly in the clothing that she's wearing. This is not anything that she would have worn in her daily life. This is not this shawl which is draped over her body is not something that she would have worn going to the First Parish church here, or walking or riding through York. This is a very stylized image. Now, why is it that this is the only one in York's burial ground? Certainly, I think that in terms of their funeral art, the citizens of York were very much, I would say rooted in the past. They, even the angel, which you see in other burial grounds in the early 1700s, only starts showing up here in the 1740s. And even to the 1790s, the death's head, which is the older image, is the dominant image. So most of the people being buried in York up to the 1790s chose the death's head. I think it was just in the culture of York to go, in terms of what you're choosing for your gravestone, to go with what your parents and your grandparents had always done. Samuel Nasson, who very probably chose this portrait stone, is doing something then radically different from what almost everyone else in York would choose. He's going with a more urban style. So Portsmouth, of course, to the south is not too far from York, but it's a bigger city than York is. It's tuned in to larger currents in urban life in Boston and even in England, right? It's less of a rural town, cut off from the more fashionable trends in art, of which gravestone art is certainly a niche subject, but it's still caught up in larger cultural trends. So Samuel Nasson is going with what's new and what's modern rather than the tried and true methods, practices. And in doing so, he may have offended some people here in York. There's no evidence, no written evidence that we have of this to be certain, except for the fact that this is the only one. But it's true that this may have been a shock to some people. Even to some people, let's say, who are buried close by to Mary Nasson and visiting their family stones. And there are stones I'm looking at which are very close to Mary Nasson, which have death's heads on them. And so those people visiting those stones may then have passed by Mary's and been shocked by this portrait stone of this semi-naked woman. So there may have been some scandalous talk. Now, not immediately after she dies, but probably in the early 19th century, there start to be the first stories and legends told about Mary as a witch. Now, a witch in English popular culture is a very long-lasting popular image. In the 17th century, you have the famous Salem witch trials. And in England, you have a series of witch trials in which hundreds of people are hanged as witches. Witches, for the early modern English colonists here and the people in England, were people who worked with the devil. They were usually women, but they could be men also, and these were criminals. That's why they were hanged, because they used their magic to harm other people, either harming property or even killing, which is a form of murder. Now, the last witch trials in New England are at Salem in the 1690s. In England, the last witch trials are in the early 1700s, 1730s. And so Mary Nasson dies many decades after the last witch trials, but yet the popular image of a witch has not really changed much from that time period. The difference is that it's no longer taken seriously by the law and by learned people in general, but by the average person. A witch in the 1700s is very probably very similar to how they would have thought of a witch in the 1600s. And so I think it likely that this is true also in the early 19th century. And so the first rumors of Mary as a witch were likely drawing on this ancient culture of witchcraft in early modern English thought. And why were people calling her a witch? This is a question we'll probably never know for certain. It does seem to indicate some sort of hostile feeling towards her. We don't know why she would have caused such, it seemingly, anger or fear. Now, the first mention that we have of this legend is a book by George Emery, in which he writes this is a history of York, and he writes in the 1880s that when he was a kid, which, if you look at his age, probably means the 1830s. Other children said that Mary Nasson was a witch. And so this means that as early as the 1830s, this rumor started. I think that very likely it started simply due to wonder over why the slab was placed here, as well as popular scandal over the image on her stone. Those were probably the two triggers. And then as time passed, the memory of who Mary Nasson was in real life and memory of her husband and her family faded, and the people who had known them personally faded. By the early 19th century, you have people still wondering these questions, but there's no answers. And there's no longer a personal tie to Mary, so calling her a witch is no longer harmful, really. And so maybe it started with children. We'll never know for certain, but certainly in the 1820s, 1830s, there were people who started saying that Mary Nasson was a witch. And this soon grew to its mature form in that the slab is said to be placed over her body to keep her ghost from rising and harming York's people. Now, this is strange because in early modern witch culture, this was not a worry that anyone had about witches. They were worried about witches while they were living, but after witches were killed, then you didn't have to worry about them anymore. This rising from the dead, from the grave, and harming people is more of a vampire type fear. Now, vampires in early modern Europe, people thought to be, were buried with a stake through their bodies to keep them from rising. There are documented instances of this happening. Now, it may be that these two sort of currents in popular belief about supernatural beings, witches and vampires, somehow merged in the formation of the legend of Mary Nasson, probably in the 19th century.